They said no poor man could survive the horse that wealth had broken, but on that blazing Texas afternoon, the town of Red Hollow was about to witness something far greater than humiliation. The summer sun scorched Main Street until the wooden storefronts shimmered like mirages, and dust rolled through the air in golden waves beneath the boots of ranchers, gamblers, and socialites who had gathered for Theodore Whitmore's annual Wild Dominion exhibition. Every year, Whitmore, the richest landowner in 3 counties, turned the town square into his personal stage, a place where power was measured not by honor, but by spectacle. His polished black boots gleamed against the platform as he stood above the crowd, silver watch chain glinting across his tailored vest, his sharp grin carrying the confidence of a man who believed money could tame anything. Beside him, restrained behind iron gates, stood Tempest, a towering black Mustang whose reputation had grown into legend. 15 hands tall, with a mane like storm clouds and eyes that burned with wild fury, Tempest had thrown every rider who dared challenge him. Some called him cursed. Others called him savage. But those who looked closely enough saw something else beneath the rage, pain. "Ladies and gentlemen," Whitmore called, his booming voice slicing through the heat, "today, we settle a question once and for all. Can a broken rancher tame what even kings cannot?" Laughter erupted as the crowd turned toward Caleb Dawson, standing near the arena fence in a faded denim shirt, worn leather hat, and dust-covered boots that had seen too many unpaid miles. At 38, Caleb looked older than his years, his broad shoulders weathered by loss, drought, and silence. Once, his ranch had thrived. Once, his laughter had filled a home where his wife and little boy waited by the porch light. But tragedy had stripped those things away like a prairie fire, leaving only a struggling man on borrowed land, one missed payment away from losing everything. Whitmore had made sure of that. "Mount the horse," Whitmore said, tossing a saddle toward the dirt with deliberate cruelty, "or sign over your remaining acres by sundown." A hush fell over Red Hollow. Caleb's jaw tightened, but he did not answer immediately. He simply stared at Tempest. The Mustang reared against the gate, muscles rippling like thunder beneath his scarred hide, his breath cutting through the heat in violent bursts. Yet Caleb did not see a monster. He saw an animal betrayed, cornered, and wounded by the same kind of merciless world that had nearly destroyed him. From the balcony of Whitmore's estate box, Eleanor Whitmore watched in silence, her gloved hands tightening. Unlike her father, she knew Tempest's true suffering. She had seen the cruel methods used to break him. She had heard his cries in the night. And now, as Caleb stepped forward into the swirling dust, she felt something unfamiliar stir, hope. The crowd leaned in. Bets were whispered. Mockery hung thick as smoke. But as Caleb reached the gate and placed one steady hand against the iron latch, the wind shifted across the arena, carrying with it the charged stillness before a storm, and for the first time in years, Red Hollow forgot to laugh. Caleb Dawson stepped through the gate with the slow, measured calm of a man who had already lost too much to fear one more cruel wager. Dust curled around his boots as the iron latch clanged shut behind him, sealing him inside the arena with 1,200 pounds of raw, untamed spirit. Tempest's powerful frame coiled like a storm held barely in check, his dark coat gleaming beneath streaks of sun, his sides rising and falling with sharp mistrust. The crowd pressed closer against the rails, expecting chaos, expecting failure, expecting the poor rancher to become another cautionary tale in Theodore Whitmore's long history of public humiliation. But Caleb did not reach for the saddle. He did not grab the reins. He did not move with the arrogance of men who believed dominance created loyalty. Instead, he removed his weathered hat, lowered his gaze, and stood still. A murmur rippled through Red Hollow. Whitmore's smug expression tightened. This was not how the spectacle was supposed to unfold. Caleb's silence stretched across the arena, deeper than the heat, deeper than the laughter. It was the kind of silence built from years. Beneath endless skies, from whispered grief in empty barns, from understanding that broken creatures did not need force. They needed trust. Tempest stomped once, snorting violently, his muscles tense as braided wire, but Caleb did not flinch. Beneath the noise of the town, beneath the pounding tension, he noticed what others had missed. The scars near Tempest's flanks. The slight tremble beneath his fury. The defensive anger of something once free, then betrayed. Caleb knew that pain. 5 years earlier, before drought hollowed his land and tragedy hollowed his soul, Caleb Dawson had been one of the finest horsemen in West Texas. His small ranch, just outside Red Hollow, had been known not for wealth, but for gentling wild horses others had given up on. His wife, Sarah, had called it his gift. "You do not break them," she once told him as twilight painted their porch gold. "You remind them they were never meant to be broken." But after the fever took Sarah and their young son within the same bitter winter, Caleb had become a ghost on his own land. The horses were sold. The laughter disappeared. Debt crept in like dry rot. Whitmore, always circling like a vulture in polished boots, had waited patiently for Caleb to fall. And now, in front of the entire town, he intended to finish what loss had started. Yet standing before Tempest, Caleb felt something stir for the first time in years. Not anger. Not despair. Recognition. Tempest lunged suddenly, surging forward with enough force to send gasps through the crowd, but instead of striking, the great Mustang stopped just inches away, his wild breath rushing against Caleb's chest. Dust exploded around them. Eleanor Whitmore rose to her feet. Theodore's knuckles whitened on the rail. Caleb slowly lifted one hand, not as a command, but as an offering. The entire arena seemed to hold its breath. Then, against every expectation wealth had ever purchased, Tempest lowered his massive head by a single trembling inch. And in that impossible moment, the town of Red Hollow began to understand that they were no longer watching a man face a beast. They were witnessing two wounded souls standing at the edge of redemption. Tempest's breath came hot and wild through flared nostrils, yet the fury in his dark eyes had shifted. What once burned like untamed lightning now carried something far more fragile beneath it: confusion, memory, and the aching uncertainty of a creature who had only known control through pain. Caleb's rough hand hovered inches from the Mustang's scarred face, patient as wind across prairie grass, asking for nothing except permission. Around them, Red Hollow stood frozen beneath the brutal Texas sun. Even the children who had laughed loudest now clung silently to fence rails, their wide eyes fixed on the impossible stillness unfolding inside Whitmore's arena. Theodore Whitmore's jaw tightened beneath his silver mustache. This was not the humiliation he had paid for. He had expected spectacle. He had expected dust, failure, and surrender. Instead, the poor rancher he had spent years crushing beneath debt was unraveling something far more dangerous than a wild horse. He was unraveling Whitmore's authority. Caleb took one slow step closer. Tempest's muscles tensed beneath his midnight coat, but the horse did not strike. Caleb's fingers finally brushed the side of the Mustang's neck, and the contact sent a visible shiver through both man and beast. Gasps swept through the crowd like prairie wind before a storm. The scars beneath Caleb's hand told stories no one else had cared to read. Old lash marks. Poorly healed welts. Signs not of savagery, but of cruelty disguised as training. Caleb's throat tightened. He had seen wounds like these before on horses discarded by men who mistook fear for defiance. Quietly, so softly only Tempest could hear, Caleb whispered, "I know, boy. I know." The words were not magic. They were recognition. And sometimes, recognition was stronger than force. From the shaded balcony, Eleanor Whitmore felt her pulse quicken. She remembered Tempest arriving at her father's ranch nearly 2 years earlier, captured from Nevada wildlands with promises of breeding fortune and racing prestige. But Tempest had never submitted. Not to Theodore's hired trainers. Not to cruel bit or iron discipline. The more they pushed, the more fiercely he resisted. Theodore had called him worthless, dangerous, broken. Eleanor had known better. She had seen the terror in Tempest's eyes after every failed attempt to civilize him. She had watched stable hands use fear where patience should have lived. And now, for the first time, someone was not trying to conquer him. Caleb slowly reached for the worn saddle lying in the dirt, his movements deliberate, transparent, leaving Tempest every chance to refuse. The great Mustang watched him carefully, ears flicking, body taut with old instinct. Then, with a trembling exhale that seemed to release years of buried torment, Tempest lowered himself just enough to allow it. The town square erupted into stunned silence so profound it felt louder than thunder. Theodore Whitmore's confident smile vanished completely. Caleb secured the saddle with steady hands, his heart pounding not from fear but from something unfamiliar and long forgotten, purpose. Dust swirled at his boots as he placed one weathered foot into the stirrup. This was no longer about land. No longer about debt. No longer about proving anything to cruel men. This was about two shattered souls standing beneath the same merciless sky, daring to trust again. And as Caleb swung gently onto Tempest's back, the wild horse did not explode in rage. Instead, he rose like a storm finally choosing its own direction, and the people of Red Hollow realized they were witnessing not a punishment, but the first breath of a legend. For one suspended heartbeat, Caleb Dawson sat upon the back of the most feared horse in West Texas, and the entire world seemed to forget how to breathe. The arena vanished beneath a cloud of sunlit dust as Tempest surged upward with breathtaking power, his massive body rising like thunder rolling across open plains. Women clutched their parasols. Men gripped fence rails. Theodore Whitmore leaned forward with sharp anticipation, certain the miracle would shatter in an instant. But Caleb did not fight the movement. He did not yank the reins or force his will against the Mustang's strength. Instead, he moved with him, his body balanced not through domination, but through understanding. Tempest burst across the arena like a black storm unleashed, his hooves hammering the earth with such force that the ground itself seemed to tremble beneath Red Hollow. Dust spiraled behind them in golden sheets. Yet what unfolded was not chaos. It was something stranger. Something sacred. Caleb leaned low, his weathered hand steady against the reins, his voice calm and low as prairie dusk. "Easy, boy. You are free." The words vanished into the roar of movement, but Tempest heard them. For the first time in years, no spurs dug into his sides. No cruel whip demanded submission. No iron hand sought to break him. Only trust. Tempest's wild bucking began to shift, not into surrender, but into rhythm. His explosive rage softened into fierce, breathtaking motion, powerful yet purposeful, like a river finally finding its course after years of flood. The crowd's jeers dissolved into stunned silence. Caleb was not merely surviving. He was riding. More than that, he was listening. Around the outer rail, old ranchers removed their hats in disbelief. They had spent lifetimes around horses, and they knew what they were seeing defied every rule men like Whitmore had ever preached. This was not conquest. It was communion. Eleanor Whitmore's breath caught as Tempest rounded the arena with growing grace, his midnight manner cutting through sunlight like a banner of reclaimed freedom. Tears burned unexpectedly behind her eyes. She had watched countless men try to crush that spirit. And now, before the entire county, a broken rancher was restoring it. Theodore's polished confidence began to crack. His knuckles whitened against the wooden balcony rail as whispers spread through the crowd. Whitmore never had control. The horse was never savage. He was suffering. Such words were dangerous in a town where wealth had long shaped truth. Caleb guided Tempest toward the center of the arena, not with force, but with subtle pressure and earned trust. The Mustang slowed, his chest heaving, powerful flanks glistening beneath the punishing Texas heat. Then, in a moment no soul present would ever forget, Tempest lowered his proud head and stood still beneath Caleb as calm as sunrise over an open range. Silence consumed Red Hollow. Not the silence of fear. The silence of revelation. A child began to clap. Then another. Soon the entire square erupted, not with mockery, but with thunderous applause that shook storefront windows and shattered years of carefully maintained illusion. Caleb Dawson, the poor rancher Whitmore had intended to disgrace, sat tall upon the once feared Mustang like a man reborn. Dust clung to his faded shirt. Grief still lived behind his eyes. But beneath the roar of astonished townsfolk, something stronger had returned to him, dignity. Theodore Whitmore's grand spectacle had become his own undoing. And as Caleb gently dismounted, resting one hand against Tempest's scarred neck, Red Hollow began to understand a truth wealth could never purchase: sometimes the wildest hearts do not need to be broken. They only need someone brave enough to believe they were never broken at all. The applause that thundered through Red Hollow should have marked Caleb Dawson's triumph, but as the dust settled beneath the burning Texas sky, he knew the true battle had only just begun. Tempest stood beside him in the center of the arena, his powerful chest still rising with effort, his dark coat streaked with sweat and sunlight, yet his once frantic eyes had softened. For the first time since his capture, the great Mustang looked less like a beast on display and more like what he had always been, a creature of dignity. Caleb rested his hand gently along the horse's neck, feeling the old scars hidden beneath coarse black hair, and a deep unease settled into his chest. These were not the marks of a naturally wild horse. These were wounds left by men. Around the square, townsfolk whispered with growing boldness. Theodore Whitmore's carefully polished image had begun to crack beneath the weight of what everyone had witnessed. But no one understood the full truth yet. From the balcony, Eleanor Whitmore descended with quiet urgency, her pale blue dress gathering dust at the hem as she crossed the arena floor. Her father's sharp voice called after her, but for once, she did not obey. She stopped a few feet from Caleb, her expression pale yet resolute. "You need to know," she said softly, glancing at Tempest with sorrow that had lived too long in silence. Caleb studied her carefully. "Know what?" Eleanor's eyes flickered toward the crowd, then back to Tempest's scarred frame. "My father never wanted to train him," she admitted. "He wanted to break him publicly. Tempest was captured because of his bloodline. He is descended from Silver Crest, one of the fastest wild racing lines ever recorded in Nevada. Worth a fortune if controlled." But when he refused, her voice faltered beneath the weight of shame. Father ordered harsher methods. He thought pain would force obedience. Caleb's jaw tightened as understanding settled like iron. Tempest had never been worthless. He had been valuable beyond measure, which made Whitmore's cruelty not just personal, but profitable. The Mustang was not a failed investment. He was a stolen legacy. Eleanor reached into the pocket of her riding coat and carefully withdrew folded registry papers, weathered but official. "I found these hidden in Father's office. Tempest was supposed to be sold to Eastern breeders months ago, but he was considered too dangerous after what they did." Caleb unfolded the papers slowly, his calloused fingers tracing the documented lineage, the branding records, the valuation. The numbers were staggering. Tempest was worth more than Caleb's ranch, more than Whitmore's cruel wager, perhaps more than Theodore had ever intended anyone to discover. The poor rancher looked into Tempest's dark eyes again, but now he saw not just pain. He saw stolen greatness. Theodore stormed into the arena, his polished composure finally splintering. "Those papers are private property," he barked, his voice sharp with desperation. But the town had changed in the span of one impossible ride. Men who once feared Whitmore's influence now looked at him differently. Women whispered openly. Even the sheriff stepped closer, his hand resting thoughtfully near his badge. Caleb folded the papers with deliberate calm. "No," he said, his voice steady as open land. "That horse is not property. He never was." Silence followed, heavy and transformative. For the first time in Red Hollow, Theodore Whitmore stood not as an untouchable king, but as a man whose wealth could no longer bury truth. And as Tempest pressed his scarred muzzle gently against Caleb's shoulder, the broken rancher understood that fate had placed far more than survival in his hands. It had given him the chance to protect a miracle. By sunset, Caleb Dawson led Tempest away from Red Hollow beneath a sky washed in copper and crimson, while the town that had once laughed now watched in humbled silence. The road back to Caleb's struggling ranch stretched 12 dusty miles across dry Texas plains, where brittle grass bent beneath evening wind and distant mesas cast long shadows like sleeping giants. Tempest walked beside him without rope or force, his powerful stride cautious but willing, as though each step away from Whitmore's estate loosened chains no one else could see. Caleb's weathered farmhouse appeared on the horizon just as twilight settled over the land, its faded white boards leaning with age, its barn roof worn by storms and seasons of hardship. It was not much, but it was honest. And for the first time in years, it did not feel entirely broken. Inside the old barn, lantern light flickered softly against rough cedar beams as Caleb removed Tempest's saddle with careful hands. Up close, beneath the dust and sweat of the arena, the Mustang's injuries told a fuller story. Faded welts lined his shoulders. Tender patches marked his flanks. His spirit had not been wild by nature alone. It had been wounded into defiance. Caleb dipped clean cloth into warm water, gently tending to each scar with the same patience he once used when life had still held laughter. Tempest flinched at first, old memories tightening his muscles, but Caleb's voice remained low and steady. "Nobody is breaking you here." The words seemed to settle deeper than touch. Night after night, beneath the quiet music of cicadas and prairie wind, man and horse began the slow work of rebuilding. Caleb did not train Tempest through fear. He walked with him across dry fields at dawn. He let him run open pasture beneath rising sun. He brushed his dark coat beneath golden evening light until suspicion gave way to trust. In healing Tempest, Caleb unknowingly began healing himself. The ranch, once hollow with grief, stirred back to life. Fences were repaired. Empty stalls were cleaned. Neighbors who had long written Caleb off began noticing signs of impossible renewal. Eleanor Whitmore, risking her father's anger, quietly visited with supplies, feed, and additional papers proving Tempest's stolen lineage. Each visit strengthened not only Caleb's legal claim, but their shared resolve. Theodore Whitmore, however, did not surrender quietly. Word spread quickly that the wealthy rancher was preparing for Red Hollow's upcoming Frontier Championship, a prestigious competition where the finest horses and riders in Texas would compete before investors, breeders, and county officials. The winner would secure both fortune and influence. Theodore intended to reclaim his reputation there. But Caleb saw something greater. The Frontier Championship was not merely a contest. It was a chance to expose truth publicly, to prove Tempest's worth beyond stolen papers, and perhaps save his ranch permanently. Still, the journey would demand more than one miraculous ride. It would require discipline, endurance, and faith. Through scorching mornings and moonlit evenings, Caleb and Tempest trained across open country, weaving through cedar brush, scaling rocky ridges, and learning one another's rhythms not as master and beast, but as equals. Tempest's speed emerged like lightning once freed from fear, breathtaking and untamed, while Caleb's old instincts returned with each passing mile. The poor rancher who had entered Whitmore's arena as a man cornered by ruin was becoming something else entirely. A guardian. A contender. A symbol. And as the first cool winds of autumn whispered across Texas dust, Red Hollow began hearing rumors that Theodore Whitmore's greatest mistake had not been humiliating Caleb Dawson. It had been placing a miracle into the hands of a man who still remembered how to believe. Autumn arrived across West Texas in waves of amber light and cooler winds, carrying with it the long-awaited day of the Red Hollow Frontier Championship. By sunrise, wagons, riders, breeders, and wealthy landowners had flooded into town. From every corner of the state, their polished boots stirring the same dusty streets where Caleb Dawson had once been mocked as little more than a defeated rancher. Banners snapped above the fairgrounds. Brass music drifted through the crisp air. Prize purses larger than most men's yearly earnings glittered beneath glass display cases. But beyond money, this competition offered something far more valuable: legitimacy. For Caleb, it was the chance to secure his ranch and prove Tempest's true lineage before officials whose records could no longer be silenced by Theodore Whitmore's influence. For Whitmore, it was a desperate opportunity to reclaim dominance before his carefully crafted empire cracked beyond repair. Theodore arrived in full spectacle, riding atop a gleaming imported stallion with silver-plated tack, his tailored coat immaculate, his expression sharpened by pride and quiet desperation. He had spared no expense. Rumors whispered that he had spent thousands preparing for this day, determined to erase the humiliation Caleb had dealt him weeks earlier. Yet as the crowd parted near the eastern gate, every polished appearance suddenly seemed smaller. Caleb Dawson entered not with grandeur, but with earned reverence. Dressed in his same weathered hat, clean denim shirt, and worn leather boots, he rode Tempest beneath the morning sun like a living symbol of everything Red Hollow had begun to believe in. Tempest's black coat gleamed like burnished obsidian, his once scarred spirit transformed into breathtaking power. His stride was proud, fluid, undeniable. No longer a broken spectacle, he looked every bit the descendant of champions hidden within his bloodline. Silence fell first. Then cheers rose stronger than thunder. Men removed their hats. Children shouted Caleb's name. Even seasoned breeders leaned forward, stunned by the Mustang's extraordinary presence. Eleanor Whitmore, seated quietly among county officials, felt tears threaten as she watched what true restoration looked like. Theodore's face darkened. The opening events tested agility, endurance, and precision across brutal Texas terrain, barrel turns through cedar posts, open sprints across half-mile stretches, steep ridge climbs, and controlled handling beneath pressure. Wealthy competitors relied on expensive bloodlines and polished appearances. Caleb relied on trust. Tempest ran not from fear, but from freedom. Together, they moved with breathtaking unity, cutting corners tighter, climbing stronger, and sprinting faster than anyone thought possible. Dust trailed behind them like a storm-chasing legend. By midday, Caleb and Tempest led the competition. Theodore's frustration became visible, each event stripping away another layer of his control. The final challenge, the notorious Sovereign Run, loomed before them, a punishing mile-and-a-half course through rocky ravines, creek beds, and open prairie where horse and rider were tested not only for speed, but spirit. Many considered it the ultimate measure of greatness. Caleb rested his hand against Tempest's neck at the starting line, feeling the steady heartbeat beneath dark muscle. "Just ride free," he whispered. Across from him, Theodore gripped his reins with the tension of a man trying to outrun collapse itself. The starting pistol cracked through autumn air, and the riders exploded forward beneath a sky vast enough to hold every prayer Red Hollow had never dared speak aloud. In that thunder of hooves, wealth, pride, cruelty, and redemption collided at full speed. And as Tempest surged ahead with Caleb riding not as conqueror, but companion, the people of Red Hollow understood they were no longer watching a race. They were witnessing justice finally learning how to run. The Sovereign Run tore across the Texas frontier like a storm written into legend, its punishing course scattering riders through cedar breaks, dry creek beds, and jagged ravines where only the strongest partnerships could endure. Dust billowed beneath pounding hooves as Caleb Dawson and Tempest surged through the wild terrain with breathtaking precision, not as man forcing horse, but as two souls moving in shared purpose. Tempest flew over washed gullies and rocky slopes with the fierce grace of a creature finally reclaimed by freedom, while Caleb guided him with quiet instinct sharpened by hardship, trust, and love. Behind them, Theodore Whitmore drove his imported stallion harder with every passing mile, desperation replacing arrogance as his dream of public redemption slipped further beneath Tempest's dark, thunderous stride. Spectators lined ridge points and fencing rails throughout the course, their cheers rolling like distant thunder across open plains. By the final stretch, only Caleb and Theodore remained true contenders. The finish line shimmered ahead near the fairgrounds grandstand, where county officials, breeders, and Red Hollow's townspeople stood waiting beneath fluttering banners and autumn sun. Theodore's stallion, magnificent yet overdriven, began to falter beneath the relentless pressure. The animal's once polished form lost rhythm, not from weakness, but from the limits of force without trust. Caleb glanced sideways, seeing not victory alone, but the familiar cost of men demanding too much from creatures they never truly respected. Tempest, however, seemed only to grow stronger, his black mane streaming like storm clouds, his breathing fierce yet steady. Then, in one breathtaking surge, Tempest broke fully into the open field, his powerful stride stretching beneath Caleb with such breathtaking speed that the crowd rose to its feet as one. They crossed the finish line lengths ahead, not merely winning, but rewriting everything Red Hollow thought it understood about worth, bloodline, and power. The roar that followed shook the fairgrounds. Hats flew into the air. Children screamed with joy. Grown men stood speechless, their eyes bright with astonishment. Caleb slowed Tempest gently, his hand pressed against the Mustang's neck as emotion tightened his throat. The broken rancher who had once stood on the edge of losing everything had not only secured victory. He had become undeniable. But fate had one final truth to reveal. As county judges moved to confirm Tempest's registry and championship standing, Eleanor Whitmore stepped forward before the grandstand, carrying ledgers, contracts, and correspondence she had secretly gathered from her father's office. Her voice, though trembling, rang clear enough for all to hear. She exposed Theodore's years of fraudulent breeding schemes, illegal capture operations, falsified horse valuations, and deliberate abuse designed to manipulate insurance and auction profits. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Breeders exchanged horrified looks. Officials examined the evidence with growing gravity. Theodore Whitmore's empire, built on wealth and fear, began collapsing not through scandalous spectacle, but through undeniable truth. For once, no amount of money could silence what had been witnessed. The sheriff himself stepped forward to begin formal seizure proceedings against Whitmore's breeding licenses and ranch holdings pending investigation. Theodore stood frozen beneath the crushing weight of public disgrace, his polished image reduced to dust beneath the same unforgiving Texas sun he once ruled beneath. Caleb said nothing. He did not need revenge. Justice had spoken for itself. As Tempest stood proudly beside him, championship ribbon gleaming against his scarred yet noble frame, Red Hollow saw clearly what Theodore never had: true greatness could not be bought, beaten, or inherited. It could only be earned. And on that autumn day, the poor rancher and the wild Mustang they had once mocked did more than win a race. Together, they set truth free. Winter gave way slowly across West Texas, and with the passing months, Caleb Dawson's once-forgotten ranch transformed beneath the steady rhythm of healing. The debt that had shadowed his land for years was cleared through Frontier Championship prize money, legitimate breeding rights awarded through Tempest's restored bloodline, and the growing support of a town forever changed by what it had witnessed. But Caleb did not rebuild his life in pursuit of wealth. He rebuilt it with purpose. The weathered ranch that had once echoed only with grief became a sanctuary for injured, abandoned, and unwanted horses from across the county. Broken fences were replaced. Empty stalls filled once more, not with commodities, but with second chances. Men who had once laughed now volunteered labor. Families donated feed. Children visited to learn not how to dominate animals, but how to understand them. At the center of it all stood Tempest, no longer the feared symbol of violence Theodore Whitmore had tried to create, but a living emblem of resilience. His powerful black frame could often be seen running free across golden pasture at sunrise, mane cutting through morning light like a banner of freedom reclaimed. Visitors came from neighboring states to witness the legendary Mustang whose spirit no cruelty had managed to extinguish. Yet despite his fame, Tempest remained most loyal to the quiet rancher who had first seen his pain instead of his fury. Caleb, too, had changed. The hollow grief that once bent his shoulders had softened, replaced not by forgetting, but by meaning. Sarah's words, spoken long ago on a porch washed in sunset, had become the very soul of his work. He was no longer merely surviving loss. He was transforming it into mercy. Eleanor Whitmore, having severed herself from her father's corruption, became an essential partner in the sanctuary's mission, using her education and resources to help establish legal protections for wild Mustangs and stricter standards for horse auctions throughout Texas. Together, she and Caleb forged something rare, not romance born of spectacle, but mutual respect shaped by truth, healing, and shared conviction. As for Theodore Whitmore, his vast empire of breeding contracts and manipulated auctions unraveled beneath legal scrutiny and public disgrace. His lands were divided, many sold off to cover fines and restitution. In time, his name became less a symbol of power and more a cautionary tale whispered whenever wealth mistook cruelty for strength. But Red Hollow itself would never forget. Each autumn, the Frontier Championship added a new tradition before its opening race. Caleb and Tempest would ride one ceremonial lap around the arena, not as competitors, but as living proof that dignity could rise from humiliation, that kindness could outlast greed, and that the wildest spirits were often the truest. On those golden afternoons, when children leaned over fences with bright eyes and old ranchers removed their hats in reverence, Caleb would often pause at the center of the same arena where his ruin had once been planned. He would rest one weathered hand against Tempest's. neck, feel the steady heartbeat beneath dark muscle, and quietly remember how close both of them had come to being broken beyond repair. Yet beneath the endless western sky, where dust, wind, and memory carried their stories forward, they had become something greater than survivors. They had become a miracle no one could have purchased, predicted, or controlled. Because sometimes, the horse the world tries hardest to break carries the very truth strong enough to set broken men free.